let's talk about the F word. The F word being, of course, feminism. Now, I know that everyone here, regardless of who you are, will have had a relationship or a view or a history with the word. But for me, my history and relationship with that word began at the age of 7. I still have words with my mum about that jumper. And I can even remember where I was and what I was doing the first time I heard it. I was having to lay the table for what seemed like 100 guests coming to my house for dinner, because I'm Asian and 100 is our minimum number. And I was absolutely furious, because I was doing all this work, and my brother, my younger brother, was being allowed to stay upstairs and play on his Nintendo game console. And I knew which one I'd much prefer to have been doing. And laying the table with me was a really grumpy aunt of mine who was meant to be helping, but she really wasn't. And she turned to me and, pointing a finger, said, "Stop being a feminist." Now, growing up in the East End of London, I've heard of many F words, and I'd heard them in many languages as well. But I'd never heard of this particular F word before. And being 7, I wanted to know immediately what it meant, especially if it was a swear word. So I crept over to my mum, who was busy in the kitchen, and I asked her, "Mum, what's a feminist?" And I thought she was going to tell me off. But she looked at me for a few seconds, and then, in the way that only mums can do, explained it to me in very simple terms. She said a feminist was simply someone who believed that women could do whatever men could do, and who campaigned for their equal rights. No idea, then, why my aunt had used this pretty cool-sounding word in such a negative way. So I declared myself a feminist right there and then, and told my mum that the next time we had 50 million guests coming, because the numbers had gone up in my head by then, my brother could lay the table. I had no idea when I made that declaration that that word was going to govern the rest of my life. And by the time I reached my teen years, my Michael Jackson-obsessed teen years, I was completely and utterly in love with any human rights cause that came my way. From Amnesty to Greenpeace, if there was a march to go on or a petition to sign or money to raise, you can bet I was there, dragging everyone along with me. But when I reached, as I was growing older and then a little bit wiser and definitely wider, I realized that wherever I looked, women and girls really did have it tough. And no matter what the cause I was campaigning for, it was the women's angle that stuck with me. And by the time I got to my university years, I decided I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I wanted to study feminisms from a global angle. And that's exactly what I did. Now, there's a reason why there's no graduation pictures hanging in my house, and that's why I look like that. Oh, God. Okay. Only for you, Jude, only for you. And I absolutely reveled in my studies. Studying feminisms opened up my worldview, because I'd heard of women who I'd never heard of before in my school books and my college books. Scientists and political activists and authors and poets, amazing women who were crying out across the centuries for things that we're still crying out for today, which is basic human rights and equality. But after I left my degree studies, it was really hard finding a job in the women's sector that I wanted to do. So I ended up doing what most mid-20-somethings do, which is work a series of really weird but wonderful jobs, sometimes really mundane, spend every spare penny I had on getting an EasyJet flight to Europe, and basically dreaming of becoming the next J.K. Rowling by the age of 30, which clearly did not happen. But all through it all, feminism was the heart and soul of me, and I looked for ways of trying to make things, trying to get into the women's rights sector, so I did that in my spare time. So to all ends and purposes, I lived a relatively normal, if somewhat kooky, and really happy 20-something life. But slowly something happened. There was a shift, and the shift came really quietly. And it came with a phone call for help that was made to my mum. Now, there are some moments in life that come upon you, life-changing moments, that are so quiet that you don't even know they've arrived. And for me, I didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight, my life and the path that has led me here was actually forged and shaped by just 2 phone calls. The first one came from this amazing woman, Mumtahina Jannat. She's a woman that I didn't even know existed until the ring of that telephone call made to my mum. And it turned out that she was a long-distant cousin of my mother's, and somehow through the Asian grapevine, which is somehow really extensive, she'd found out that we lived in London and had managed to get hold of our number. And she was calling it from the confines of a women's shelter. She had managed to escape to this shelter with her 2 baby daughters from a really abusive husband who actually held her captive not far from here for 3 whole years after forcing her to marry him. And no one had a clue. We didn't know about her existence. And as soon as my mum received the call, being an activist herself, there was no way that we weren't going to help. So for 5 years, my aunt was a stunning addition to our lives. Not just because of the fact that she loved baking and we loved cake, and she had this amazing giggle of a laugh, and she loved Bollywood to the point where it was quite insane, and she brought her 2 beautiful daughters with her. But she also opened up our eyes as to just how unjust our justice systems were for women of no means escaping a perpetrator of abuse of means, because her husband was a very rich man. Sorry. For 5 years, we used all our resources. We did whatever we could. We dealt with housing services and local council and women's centres and the police and anyone we could to try and get her free of this man that she was trying to flee. And for 5 years, we tried to convince all the personnel from all the agencies we were dealing with that the kind, gentlemanly doting father they were seeing was anything but, and that he was still harassing and stalking and chipping away at her life. But as it turned out, it was all in vain. Because just a few months after a judge called my aunt a silly woman in court for stating her fears that the man that she was trying to escape was capable of killing her, I received the second call that changed my life. And this time it was from a neighbor of my aunt's who was ringing to tell me that she had been murdered. 5th July 2011. That was the day that completely upended my world, and it shattered my faith in all the agencies I had looked to stop our worst fears from coming true. Sorry, I still get really... My aunt's murder has created ripple effects that are unending. They are never ending. Guilt for not being able to save her, numbness, disbelief, anger, they're all emotions, they're all just tips of an iceberg of emotions that we feel every single day, my family and I and her 2 beautiful daughters that she was forced to leave behind. But no moment of anger is more crystal clear to me than the moment I finished reading her homicide review report conducted by the Home Office. Because this wasn't just a report, it wasn't just a review. It was a single document that vomited out fact after fact, detail after detail about my aunt's case that we never knew about. And the most glaring thing to me of all was the fact that none of this information from GPs and suspicions by police officers and call logs and women's centres and volunteers and social services and local housing, none of that information had been shared with each other. They didn't share it with each other. And worst of all, they hadn't given my aunt a single piece of documentation, solid documentation of their suspicions and their assessment data that she could take into court with her. So for the 5 years she was paraded in front of judges and endless lawyers, she went with just her word against his and being rich, the very rich legal team that he could afford. Reading that report, I kind of fell into just this black hole of depression. It was, I couldn't believe everything I was seeing, all these details, and the institutions that I'd put so much faith in seemed broken to me somehow. There was this endless well of anger and this eternal atom of guilt which we all live with today for not being able to save her and do more and force that agency to do more. But it also served to kick me awake. And a few months after my aunt's murder, I decided I had to do something, anything. And maybe I couldn't fix this massive problem because it was so massive, it's so magnificent. How do you go around trying to fix something that's affecting hundreds of women a week? But I could maybe, just maybe, help some of the hundreds of women who are fleeing their abusers and perpetrators and potential murderers by doing what I could in my little community. So with the help of some really amazing friends, I set up a small book club, very unofficial, and something that I wanted my friends and acquaintances to come along, and the intention was very simple. We would raise just a few pounds, whatever we could, every few months or so, and donate that money to a women's shelter in my aunt's name. But you know that story, build it and they will come? Well, I hadn't really built anything, and I wasn't really intending to build anything. But slowly people were coming and asking questions and trying to find out ways of helping, and also friends were coming forward with their stories and their worries. And suddenly, this small thing that had been born of so much anger and despair became this, an actual organization with a logo and a board of trustees and paperwork that I really hate doing, but I have to do it. And this creation that was governed and fueled by my need to do something to make me live with myself for my aunt's murder and to cope with it in the best way I can, became a living, breathing vision. A vision where women and men and boys and girls from all walks of life could let go and set aside their differences and work towards the one goal of ending the horrific monstrosity that is the abuse of female human beings that happens every single day. And a vision where institutions and agencies could get rid of their weird egotism when it comes to information. Like, I don't understand that. It's not gold. You can share it. And actually work together for once. And not only work together, but work with us, the so-called ordinary Joes on the ground. Because we're not to be underestimated. We have knowledge, and we are willing and ready to fight this fight, which needs to be fought on every single street of every corner of the globe. And just to give you an example of the works that we're capable of, a couple of years ago, I received a call from a police officer. And I couldn't really remember him. It was a weird call. I couldn't remember him. I couldn't remember the event that we met at. But somehow he'd remembered us. And he was calling us on behalf of a young woman who'd been trafficked into the country, and not just trafficked, but she'd been raped countless times. And it was without doubt a fact that she would either have been sold into the sex trade or would have been sold into some kind of forced marriage. But he was ringing because she has managed to escape with just a toothbrush and no shoes, no clothes, nothing, no documentation. And she was being treated medically. But thanks to the funding cuts, which have once again hit the news this week, there wasn't a single space at a local women's shelter or a safe house that could take her in. And he was absolutely petrified that they were going to lose her, or she was going to end up in some form of institution that would just add trauma upon trauma. So could Making Herstory raise a little bit of money to give her safe accommodation for a few nights until they could find a bed for her? Now, I run Making Herstory from the corner of my living room on top of my full-time job and in between crazy family life. But and at that time we had absolutely no emergency funds available. We only raised what was needed by the shelters. So when I put the phone down, it was with a really heavy heart, and I was trying to think if I had if I had savings in my own bank that I could use for this. But I decided, no, the world needs to know, that our communities need to know what's going on. So after talking to my trustees, who all agreed with my idea, we put out a call for help on our Facebook and Twitter and website, etc. And within 24 hours, we not only had enough money to give her accommodation for more than the 3 days, but people were popping around with suitcases of new clothes and shoes and gifts and messages of hope and amazing, amazing offers of help. For example, there was a counsellor who said, I'll give her free counsel for a year. And that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps us going. We're now working with schools, and we're working with, in partnership with theatre companies and, all of these amazing, amazing institutions, because the people out there are already doing great works. We don't need to rebuild or, reinvent the wheel. It's already happening. We just need to join up. And if we can join up, we can save so many lives. And therein lies the hope that this vision I have of everyone working together, whether it's agencies with each other or with agencies with us or us with each other, is kept alive. Because if there are 50 people out there waiting to help every single woman and child that comes forward in need, how can it not come to fruition? It must come to fruition, and it will, hopefully. And for every single person that comes forward to help us, whether it's a school counsellor or whether it's someone who's been through something that we're trying to dismantle, or whether it's a child who has had the courage to come forward and say that what I've seen in this play has influenced me, or whether it's a refugee that we've helped in the refugee camps, all of those people give me that golden nugget of hope that keeps me going, because there are some days when I can't go on and I don't want to. I want to give this up, and I want to just go back to that carefree state I was in my mid-20s. But I can't, because I can't go back to a state of not knowing. And for all the people that come forward and help, and for all you wonderful people listening today, I'm reminded of a beautiful quote by one of my favorite poets that keeps me going as well. And it's this: knowing is not enough, we must act. And willing is not enough, we must do. And keeping ourselves together and fighting on and using mantras like this is exactly what we need to be doing right now. Thank you so very much for listening.